Hi, welcome to Triggered with Rob, a not too serious mental health podcast where we interview and discuss real life issues with real life people. I'm Rob Cox, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and a clinical supervisor. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So today we are going to be going over a diagnosis that is a subset of obsessive compulsive disorder. It's known as scrupulosity. So scrupulosity sounds like an old-fashioned word because it is. It dates back to the 16th century, and it comes from the word scruples, which means a conscious or an overactive conscience. And according to the National Library of Medicine, scrupulosity is a psychological disorder primarily characterized by psychological, pathological guilt or obsession associated with moral or religious issues. Often it's accompanied by compulsive moral or religious observance. So in the United States, it's estimated that 2.3% of people will experience OCD in their lifetimes. And of this percentage, as many as 33% will experience scrupulosity specifically. In the DSM-5, it actually has religious observance or religious obsession as the fifth leading cause of or focus of OCD. So, but I'm very excited to introduce our guest. So our guest, his name is Kendall Brady, and Kendall and I have been friends and known each other since 2013. I think it was, or no, I'm sorry, 2003. There it is. So a little bit longer. But we became roommates in college and have been just the best of friends ever since. So despite our close relationship, it's only been within the past few years that I've known that he's had OCD or scrupulosity. And I'm really very grateful for Kendall and excited for him to be on the show. So thanks, Kendall, for being willing to do this.
No problem. I'm excited to do it.
Great. So, like I said, it's only been within the last few years that you have shared with me that you had scrupulosity, though I feel like just since you told me, I've kind of remembered things from when we were in college that start to click and make sense.
Yeah.
But maybe you can just share a little bit about about your experience with scrupulosity. We can start as far back as you want to go.
Well, it's funny, when we were friends in college, the reason I didn't share it with you is I didn't know what it was. I didn't learn. I guess I would have thought of myself as someone who had a little more anxiety than the regular person, but it wasn't until, in my late 20s that I ever heard the term scrupulosity, and then later learned that it's really just a specific type of OCD, which is, I always just refer to it as OCD because scrupulosity is such a weird word and it sounds made up.
It does. Yeah, it does sound
But now I'm curious, is it the DSM-5? Does it actually have the term scrupulosity in there now?
It doesn't, at least the version that I have, the version that I have, I got in grad school. And since then, they've done the text revisions of the DSM-5. So there may be a specific mention of it there, but there's lots of disorders, lots of mental conditions that aren't specifically mentioned, although they are a diagnosis, which is confusing. But
yeah, that's interesting.
yeah.
So I didn't really know what it was until I was in my late 20s. And I want to say that in college, when we first met, it wasn't as much of an issue in my life. And so I wouldn't have really, I think I thought at the time that it was something I'd grown out of that was more an issue when I was a teenager. But, I remember all the way back to my childhood, things that little things, being a kid who worried too much, things like that. But I think it wasn't until probably age 12 or 13, probably I would imagine puberty probably had an effect to kind of, ramp things up a little bit. But I remember that's my earliest memories of starting to obsess over things. And for me, it was always issues of morality, mostly issues of right and wrong, specifically in situations where I'd question my honesty, you
Okay,
know,
yeah.
cheating on a test in school, lying to someone, saying something that's not quite accurate. That would always get me. Or situations where I thought I might have offended someone, even in the smallest way. That would torture me.
Yeah.
And as a kid, the most of the time when you read about scrupulosity, it's often tied in with religious things. I didn't have too much of the obsessions with like you hear a lot about people who have obsessions about prayer or different types of religious observance where they have to follow steps and do it in a certain way. I didn't have that experience, but it was really an obsession over just kind of I don't know whether or not my soul was saved, because
Right.
I think I may have accidentally cheated on my math test, and therefore, cheating is a sin, and it goes on
Right.
and on. And
So,
so, go ahead.
so I was just taking that experience of when that math test. Do you remember, did you actually cheat on that math test? Do you, like, looking back
Oh,
now?
no, that was just an example. I don't have any
Okay.
memory of
All right.
cheating on it, although I don't remember. But
Yeah.
here's an example. I remember in high school, probably my freshman year, being in a biology class, and another kid in the class asked me to help him with something on his homework, and I inadvertently just did it for him instead of helping him learn how to do it. And then in my mind, I thought I had done something wrong because he was turning in work that he didn't do, and that bothered me for months.
Wow.
Right, that one, I never did. The way it works with OCD is you've got the obsession and the compulsion. So the obsession was,
So it's
I did
aptly
something.
named, is what you're saying.
Yeah, 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 exactly. And it's a disorder.
Yeah.
So there's the acronym.
There it
But
is.
the obsession was I did something wrong, and the compulsion is to do something to right the wrong. And so in that case, it would have been go to the biology teacher and tell him what I did. But I knew that I'd sound ridiculous, and so I never did that, thankfully. But there were plenty of other cases where, if I remember my Spanish teacher, I did something that I perceived as being rude. I don't think it was. It was just a kid being a kid. And so probably weeks afterwards, I approached her after class to apologize. And of course, she had no idea what I was talking about. I remember a similar experience with the cross country coach. I ran cross country one year, and it could be the littlest thing, but if I think that I was slightly disrespectful, it'll torture me. And I remember that one, it tortured me for a couple of months, and finally I couldn't live with it, so I had to go to my cross country coach and apologize for whatever it was that I said. And the tricky thing with that when you're a kid is it gets reinforced by adults who don't know what's happening.
Right.
What they see is what they think they're seeing is a really great kid. Wow, this kid's really polite, really. And so what the response would always be, wow, buddy, I don't even remember that happening, but good for you, thanks for. And so I would get in situations like that, I would get praise and reinforcement, and sometimes I just get weird looks.
Right.
But most of the time I was way too scared to actually follow through with it. So these little experiences would just torture me for months on end.
Right. And thus creating a situation where you see yourself as unworthy, because you've done
Yeah,
all
from
these
a
things,
religious
correct?
view.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was a lot of things like that. And it the funny thing with OCD, I wonder sometimes what would my experience have been had I not been raised religious. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and grew
Right.
up in a very devout family, and still am. And I always wonder, the OCD isn't the scrupulosity, the specific subset of OCD is not caused by religion. It's
Right.
just if you have OCD and you happen to be very religious, especially in a religion where there's a lifestyle that you live, it'll just latch onto it. And so, I kind of wonder, had I not grown up religious, would I've been obsessively hand washing,
Well, yeah.
who
So
knows?
one of the things that the DSM is pretty clear on is this isn't the case with all disorders, but with OCD specifically, there is typically a genetic component. So even if it wasn't your parents, it's likely that it would only be maybe a generation removed. So,
Yeah.
you know, but a lot of times with our grandparents or people, they hide these things pretty well, because they feel similar to how you did when you were a kid, which is you feel ashamed of it. And when you feel ashamed, it's hard to, open up the closet door and let the monster out, right? And, it's easier to
Yeah.
keep it inside.
Yeah. And it's, I don't remember being ashamed of it. It was more just, it was, for example, I remember, sometimes if I would say something to another kid at school, he'd call me a name and I'd call him a name, that kind of thing. And then I would realize, calling someone a name or calling somebody a derogatory term or whatever is a sin. I'm not so sure that it is now when you're 16 years old, but when I was a kid, that was my view. And sins must be repented of. Therefore, the only way for me to resolve that sin was to approach that kid and apologize, you know. And I remember one situation where it was a kid and he was much cooler than me on the popularity scale. And there was no way I was going to go up to him and say, hey, remember that one time when you did this to me and I said this to you and I'm sorry, but that just wasn't going to happen. So,
Right.
so that one tortured me for, I don't even know how long, months,
So would these experiences, would they overlap each other then? Would you kind of be racked with guilt from a math test, from biology, from what you
Yeah.
said to a kid on the, in school? So it would be
There,
multiple things.
I was usually carrying at least one around, and
Right.
the ones that were resolvable, where I would put it off for weeks, if not a couple of months, and then approach the person or the situation, whatever, and I would, kind of check it off my list. And in my naive young mind, I thought, okay, I'm good. I just won't do any more of these,
Right.
And sure enough, a month, a week would go by, and something else would happen, and
Well,
dang it.
Well, one of the things with OCD and scrupulosities, even specifically, is that, like you said, you had very well-meaning adults in your life who would reinforce this, creating this feedback loop of experiences where you would have this experience where you feel guilty because of something that you said or did, and then you would allow that anxiety to attach itself to that, and so you going to that person and saying, hey, I'm sorry for this, even if it was after months, it would provide this short-term relief where you felt,
Big time.
man, I feel good now. But
Yeah.
typically with this, it only lasts a short amount of time.
Yep.
One of the things that you said too is it isn't a religious issue, so it's an
Yeah.
anxiety issue. It's an anxiety disorder. So
Yeah.
one of the examples that I've shared with people with OCD before is it's like a client who's afraid of contracting hepatitis, despite not doing any of the standard activities associated with becoming infected, like sharing needles, engaging in risky, unprotected sex, things like that. But
Hmm.
so, but they're still terrified of catching or contracting hepatitis. Do you, like, in your experience, do you think that is an accurate comparison?
Yeah. It was definitely, I lived in fear of my soul being tainted, and this wasn't every moment of every day. I worry about sometimes because I'll talk to my parents about it, and they start to say, oh, we're sorry, we had no idea. And I'm like, no, I had a happy childhood. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't all the time, it was just, it was an episodic thing that very much influenced my childhood and my growing up and my
Yeah.
young adulthood, but it wasn't all the time. But it was definitely a disruptive thing that kind of came and went throughout my life. The really tricky thing with OCD, especially scrupulosity, is it gets wrapped up in your religious doctrine. And so as a kid, I didn't have a voice in my head, but I didn't hear voices, but it was like a voice in my head always telling me to be better. And then in church they would talk about the still small voice, God whispering, speaking to you through the Holy Spirit,
Right.
inspiring you, guiding you through life. And so I was absolutely sure that I was more sensitive to that than other kids, that I really thought I was special, in the sense that God was, sharpening me with a painful blade,
Which is another
to turn me into
comparison.
something better,
Yeah.
And I thought, it's horribly painful, but he's teaching me to be completely honest. He's teaching me to never say an unkind word to anyone, all these things. And, and then it's really tough when, you don't have the understanding to know what's going on. And the adults in my life always perceived me to be this really stand-up good kid, because I didn't lie because I couldn't,
Right.
I didn't have a problem with swearing because it just wasn't a possibility for me.
So,
It wasn't virtue. It was,
right.
I was,
It was anxiety. Yeah.
yeah. And so, but it would get reinforced. And so, I had, this false idea that, that when God speaks to you through the Holy Spirit, that it's constantly, I was being harassed into being good. And I don't believe that at all anymore. I've realized, that's, I still have all the same religious beliefs I had as a kid, but I know the difference now between my mental illness and, God speaking to someone through the Holy Spirit, which is never harassment. It's love, it's kindness, it's gentle. It's,
Right. Well, and
it-
going back to just the etymology of the condition, or the, at least the first mention of it from the 16th century. It's from monks who
yeah.
were trying to attain this impossible expectation of spiritualism, of holiness. And
Yeah, I would have fit in with that group.
yeah. Well, thank goodness for medication, right? But
Yeah.
which is something that they didn't have so much of back in the day. Plus,
No.
So many people are just unsure of, like you said, of these well-meaning adults, these religious figures. Do you feel that this should be discussed more in a religious setting?
Um, I don't know. Well, like, what was the stat that you read? 3.2% of the
Uh,
population has OCD, and then about a third of those have this type of OCD. So it's relatively rare. And so I think it's one of those things that anyone, if you're a youth leader in a church, if you're a pastor, if you're a priest, if you're a bishop in our church, it's a thing that's very useful to be aware of.
yeah.
It would have been great if, one of my bishops, when I was coming we're, I don't know how much I need to explain to your audience. We're both members of the same church.
Right.
In our church, we have a bishop who's like a pastor, and there's a process similar to confession in the Catholic Church, where you go when there's something real serious that's happened in your life. There's a process of confession where you go to, it's not just about the confession; it's about going getting help when you've screwed up big time. But as a kid, I found myself in there a few times talking about things that just didn't need to be talked about.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if my bishop had known about this, if, when I came in to tell him something for the second time, because I had to make sure that he understood exactly what happened.
Right.
If it had been me on the other side of that desk, I would have said, I would have been asking, does this happen a lot? Do you have, and I don't blame him for not knowing, because I didn't know. Who knew back in the 90s about anything like this?
Well, especially when you think about, in our, faith, it's a lay ministry, so you could have an architect, who's serving as a bishop, and this individual isn't going to know anything about scrupulosity.
Yeah.
But
My bishop in that example he's a forester, Why would I expect to know about that? So it's,
But as a child, you put all your faith in this individual because they're your spiritual leader, and
yeah. And I knew nothing about mental illness. I knew nothing about OCD. And so in my mind, it was a 100% a spiritual issue I was dealing with. So
yeah,
yeah, I think it would do a lot of good in all churches, for at least leadership in churches to be aware, have a basic understanding of different types of mental illness,
right,
and a good understanding of what they are and aren't capable of. I think a lot of church leaders, I think there are pastors in Christian churches that have training as counselors, but like in our
right.
church, for example, like you said, it's a lay ministry. And I think
Well,
more recommendations to therapists is never a bad thing.
I completely agree, and it's not because I think that there's anybody out there without good intentions, but if the answer that you or somebody dealing with this disorder received from their pastor or spiritual leader was pray more and read the scriptures more, I mean that would
Yeah.
reinforce this even further.
Yeah. Be
So
more devout,
it,
torture yourself more.
right, yeah, exactly.
This is happening because you're not doing enough. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or
And
or like what you're saying, God's really trying to make something of you, which, arguably isn't that true for anybody,
yeah.
but that's not exactly the way that somebody who has OCD is reading that or hearing that.
Yeah.
So with so if somebody listening to this is experiencing similar symptoms, what would you suggest?
Um, I think, well, the first thing I'd recommend is just learning more. I guess I could talk a little about my experience of finding out what it is and
Yeah,
getting help, and
I love
how
that.
that help is if that's,
Yeah, please.
it was in my late 20s. I learned, from randomly from a podcast, I learned the term scrupulosity, and, and the explanation, the light bulbs went off. I said, there's a term for this,
Wait a second. So there's another mental health podcast out there. I was pretty sure that I was breaking new ground with
No,
this.
it wasn't. It was actually a religious
Oh,
podcast.
okay, gotcha. Sorry, I apologize.
But
Continue.
yeah. And so then it was interviewing someone who had this same disorder, way more severe than I've ever had. But it was pretty amazing to hear, wow, there's a term for this. And then later I learned, okay, it's a form of OCD. And then, I was able to get online and find, articles and forums and read about it was pretty amazing to read descriptions that talk about my exact experience and realize, okay, I'm not the only one, and this is a real thing. And I'll tell you what really was a powerful experience for me was not just finding articles about the disorder, but then reading the comments under the article, because all of the comments were other people who were, they'd share a paragraph or two of, wow, this is totally me. And they'd talk about their childhood or their experiences. And it was like every comment, it was like reading about my own life with different circumstances. It was kind of
Right.
amazing, and that was just really, I guess, therapeutic to see other people have this. There's a name for
You're
this. It's a
you're
real
not
thing.
alone. It's not something
Yeah.
that is a
Yeah.
yeah.
And then so that's the first thing I would recommend to someone. If you think that this is something you're struggling with, learn as much as you can, read about it as much as you can. I always came away feeling a lot better, learning more. I always feel better knowing more than knowing less. And then being able to, when I'd have those experiences, suddenly have this kind of tool in my my tool belt or whatever, to, something would happen and I'd have the same emotional response, the same, I always call them mini panic attacks, where my heart's racing. I look totally
Right.
normal on the outside, but on the inside, I'm freaking out. My heart's racing.
Yeah.
And I'd be able to say, okay, I know what this is. This is my OCD. And don't do anything. And it was like, I was able to get through it and not give into the compulsion. So
Right.
that was a big change for me. And so that, and then a couple
You,
years into that.
you know,
Oh,
I
go
should
ahead.
say that's one of the main treatments for OCD is it's called exposure and response prevention, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what it is. It's in some cases inducing the anxiety provoking experience, and then not doing anything about it, just noticing the thoughts that you have, because it's instead of being so in the panic attack, as you said, or being in the anxiety, you don't recognize what's happening to you. You just kind of disassociate, and
Yeah.
you just kind of allow yourself to be taken down the river rather than noticing the water, for being
Yeah.
wet. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. That's so true. And yeah, I'll tell you the tough thing with, because I've read a little bit about the exposure therapy. The tough thing with what I deal with is the exposure would be, go do something you're not supposed to do.
right.
Go steal something and don't give it back.
you know I,
And
I've
so
thought a
it's
lot about
it,
that, yeah. And especially because I feel like that would in a lot of cases be counterproductive, but
yeah.
I do feel that there are normal circumstances that somebody with scrupulosity goes through, such as the thinking that you've been dishonest.
Yeah.
So I want you to go out and tell somebody that you're having a good day when you know that you're struggling right now with this condition.
Yeah.
So then doing that, notice your thoughts. What thoughts are contributing? Notice those feelings that are rising, and then most important, notice them dissipate. Because it really is, our feelings and emotions are transient, and
Yeah.
they come in like a wave, and just like a wave they go back. But that's and I just think it's fascinating that you went through this process that I would typically go through with a client to just to reduce the symptoms associated with scrupulosity or OCD.
Yeah, well, and it's the funny thing too, with going back to the exposure therapy, is you don't have to create the situation. They'll happen.
Right. Yeah,
Give it a
exactly.
couple of days and something will come up. And yeah, and I'm not getting the timeline right. I'm thinking back
I
about six
did
or
interrupt you. I
no,
apologize
no,
about
no.
that.
It's okay. I'm not remembering very well, but I'm talking about 6 to 8 years ago, timeline wise, and yeah, I just remember being at that point where I knew exactly what it was. I knew exactly what it was doing. But there were some situations that were too intense, and I didn't have the ability to just watch the water go by, as you say,
Right.
and sometimes I did, and sometimes I didn't. If it kind of would depend on the severity of the situation. If if it's something that I know that everyone, if I were to ask someone, what do you think of this, they'd say that's nothing. That situation is nothing. You don't, you know, I know when the situation really is nothing. And those ones I was able to just kind of, let the emotions happen, let it happen, and just, you know, white knuckle through it. Whereas the other ones, if there was any gray area, you know, um,
Yeah.
the yeah, I couldn't handle the ambiguity of it. I have to know. I had to know if I'm okay or not. And that's, I guess, yeah, that's the first thing I would recommend, is educate yourself as much as you can, read everything you can. Not that anyone needs to be an expert, but just thoroughly convince yourself that this is a legitimate disorder. You're not making it up.
Mm.
People say it's all in your head. Well, yeah, it is. All your thoughts are in your head. It's
Right.
a real thing. If you're a religious person, this is not God talking to you. This is not the Holy Spirit. This is just OCD.
Yeah.
And that's a big step. The next thing I did was I went to see a doctor. I had talked to a couple of therapists before without great results, because there's a variety of therapists out there, and
No,
there was
we're all
nothing wrong.
great. We're all amazing. There's not a
No,
variety. I'm just
the couple that the tough thing also is I had not correctly self-diagnosed myself the first time I tried going to therapy. And so I didn't go in with the right, hey, here's what I'm here for. It was more just, my life isn't quite what I want it to be, and I'm struggling and things like that. And that therapist was um, did a fine job, but I think had I gone and said, "This is what's wrong," then you know,
Right. I think I'm actually going
um,
to do an episode one of these days on finding a therapist, like what the process is, the preparation that
yeah,
should go into it. Because as a therapist, a lot of my friends and family have come to me, and I've been grateful to help many of them find a therapist because
yeah,
they, it is hard because if you just go in, cold as you did and just emote all over the situation, some therapists can, see the forest for the trees or vice versa, but it really does help to have a little bit more of a direction. But that makes a lot of sense that you had varying results.
yeah. And I think if somebody, if you've, it's not hard to diagnose yourself with scrupulosity. Read a couple descriptions online, you'll say, "Yep, that's a,
Right.
it's a very specific thing." And so, I think if someone's looking for a therapist, ask, contact them and just use that word. If they've never heard of it, move on to the next one. Find somebody who knows, so they're
Yeah.
not trying to treat you for something else, or you
Which
don't
is
want to.
another difficult thing that people with scrupulosity find themselves with, is that if they've even gotten to the point of diagnosing themselves accurately and they are,
Yeah.
looking for a therapist, then it's okay. What kind of a therapist? I can't go to, some godless atheist. It
Yeah, and
has
I
to.
wouldn't. That was my concern as well, and
Right.
I would, and I would definitely, I was afraid I'd find somebody who would say, "Well, the problem is your church," and I'd be like, "No, no, no, it's not." What's interesting is I had that first therapist I went to recommended me going to a doctor and trying medication, and I was very resistant back then because medication is for crazy people, and I have this little problem. I'm not crazy, and
Right.
I had a bias and a what's the word I'm looking for?
Uh,
Um, any,
Pre-existing,
I
misconception or.
yeah, I just thought I don't want to be one of those people, and now it's like I'm so grateful to be one of those people.
Yeah.
So I ended up contacting getting an appointment with a psychiatrist just through my insurance. I
Mhm.
didn't pick out a specific doctor, and went and met with this guy, and he had actually never heard of it.
No kidding.
So I had to tell him, this is what it's called. It's scrupulosity. It's the subset of OCD. And I told him all about it, everything I learned about what it is, and then my experience. And then when I went back for my second session with him, he goes, "Yeah, I looked into it, and yep, you've got it." So
That's
it was
great.
pretty interesting. And, this guy, he was a psychiatrist, which is a medical doctor. But man, he's the best therapist I ever went to. I probably only had 3 or 4 sessions with him, but
Wow.
man, that guy could listen.
That's great.
And yeah, he got me started on medication, and I think I tried medication the first time, and I don't think I took it serious enough, didn't take it regularly enough, and it didn't have an effect. And then a few months later, I had I guess I'll call it a mental breakdown. That sounds scarier than it was, but
Can you explain a
just
little bit of what that meant?
yeah, just well, I had mentioned before how growing up the symptoms kind of came and went. In my early 20s, when we first became friends, my symptoms were at kind of an all-time low. And it's partly because I had learned I never lie, I never cheat, I never
Right.
call, I never say anything rude to anybody. I think I said rude things to people not realizing it, but never purposely. Don't
Right.
it wasn't about being kind. Don't set yourself up to have to apologize.
Hmm.
And so I'd really learned to walk a fine line in life, and I thought, well, I think I grew out of that, whatever that was. And where was I going with this? um
Well,
you can
you were about
edit
medication.
out this long pause.
Yeah. No, no, that's
um
fine.
oh yeah, okay, so it kind of came and went through life, and I found after I got married about 10 years ago, and I
Congratulations, by the way.
thanks.
10
Yeah,
years later.
10 years 10 years in August. It's been great. She's
Congratulations. That's
amazing.
great.
And I had talked to my wife about, when we were dating, told her told her about this a little bit, but I didn't, even back then, I didn't fully have the right understanding of it. But it was a few years into being married. You know, we had a daughter and a new baby, and you know, busy life, and work that was stressful
Mm-hmm.
often. And I think all of that just kind of hit me. And I remember a couple of weeks where I just had it got a little weirder and scarier than it had ever been, to where, you know, somewhat delusional thoughts, and just things got really crazy. And then I just remember there was one night where I just broke down crying and talking to my wife and saying, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And she, you know, this is after I had been to the doctor one time and didn't really take the medication serious. And it was great because it was finally like, I'll do anything to not be in this place again. So
Right.
so we both agreed, I'm going back to that doctor, going to try it again. So did that, and then got on the medication and said, I'm taking this every day. I'm, you know,
Do you
I'm going to
mind?
just trust this guy.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing what medication you're on?
It was Prozac the first time. I'm not
Okay.
on that anymore, which is funny because that's one I'd actually heard of. So the doctor tells me, he says, I'm going to start you on a low dose of Prozac, and I immediately said, that's crazy pills, man.
That's not me.
Because it's like, that's the drug crazy people take, you know. And he goes, don't call it crazy pills, it helps a lot of people. I'm like, all right. So
Right.
Prozac's amazing though. There's a reason they call it the sunshine drug. So I
Mm.
started taking that, and it, like, within days it changed everything. Like, it was amazing,
Really?
on a very low dose. Yeah, I don't know if I know a lot of people haven't had that experience. But after I got on that medication, he set me up for one appointment with a therapist, which I went to one appointment. I didn't end up going back because I didn't need to. The medication, I don't, it's weird to put a number on it, but I've always said it cleared up 90% of my symptoms.
Wow.
And it was just an incredible thing. And
You said
let's see, my,
you're so you started on Prozac, but at some point you
yeah, a
changed.
couple years in. So I deal with restless leg syndrome. And there was one time where for a couple of weeks it just got out of control, and I was suspicious that the Prozac, because it can be a side effect.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was suspicious of that. So I went into I ended up I was on different insurance, so different psychiatrists, and he got me on clomipramine, which is you know this, but it's the number one drug used for treating OCD. And so I switched over to that, and I've been on that for a few years. And yeah, it's incredible how well it works. I take this little orange pill every day, and you know,
Yeah.
all the scary thoughts go away.
Well,
But so I guess back to what would I recommend to someone is, you know, first learn everything you can about it. If you can find a therapist that really knows this disorder inside and out, I think it'd be great to talk to someone. And I would recommend to anyone, don't be afraid to go to a psychiatrist. Don't be afraid of trying medication. It's amazing what it can do to help. And don't be like I was, where you sort of um, think, you know, be afraid to take medication because it somehow makes you lesser. You know, if I had a disorder in my liver or high cholesterol or something, I wouldn't be afraid to. I take medication for my restless legs, and I'm not embarrassed to talk about that. What's the difference? You know?
right.
So, so yeah, it's that's, I would definitely recommend, you know, go see a therapist, go see a doctor. There's so much help out there. And for me, it's just it felt like miraculous. You know, I don't see it as a, you know, religious miracle. I just see it as, you know,
Mm.
medication doing its thing. But the really amazing thing with getting on the medication was uh, right away, within days or less than a couple of weeks, I think, I would have the experiences that would normally trigger my anxiety and the obsession. And I always notice them when they happen. But it's like your analogy with the river. Suddenly, instead of being
Right.
washed down the river, it's like I'm just standing there, you know, watching the water go by. And I'm like, oh, this is one of the things that gets me. And I just, I wouldn't have the emotional reaction, or I would have, you know, 10% of the emotional reaction that I'd had before. And I could just watch it go by. And the really amazing insight that I had because I feel like the medication allowed me to just, take the emotion from a 10 down to a 2 or a 1,
Wow,
and
that's
and
great.
allow my brain to be in control. And so I could say, no, you didn't do anything wrong, or no, this doesn't matter. And the really amazing kind of aha moment was, before, it was always, there's a situation, you've done something, you said something, there's something that needs to be resolved. And the only two options I ever had was follow through with the compulsion and do something embarrassing or whatever it is, or uh, suffer,
Right.
obsess over it, possibly for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
This is how I felt. And in my mind, those were the only two options. And after I got on the medication and it, took the emotional response down, I realized there's a third option, which is to do nothing.
Yeah.
And it sounds so obvious, but that was a revelation for me, that these situations come up and I could see them. And I remember telling myself, your job right now is to do nothing. And don't question if you're right or wrong. Don't question your morality. Just live in the ambiguity, and it's fine. And that was an incredible thing. And I don't think about it day to day anymore because I've gotten used to it. But it was very life changing.
I think that that's a really important thing for people who potentially are struggling with OCD or scrupulosity, to realize that that is a third option. So one of the being this open about your mental health issues, do you find that that's been a net positive thing for you? Have you received generally support? And how is that experience, just being open about your mental health issues?
I'm trying to think how open I am. I mean, my whole family knows about it. When I started medication, that was the first time I talked to my parents. My dad kind of knew growing up because he was kind of my go-to.
Okay.
Neither of us knew what was going on, but he was kind of my go-to for spiritual questions. It was after I went to a psychiatrist, that was the first time I talked to my mom about it. And I've shared it with all my siblings and some close friends. I talked to you about it a few years ago, and other friends who, I've got another close friend who, uh, I don't want to say names but it's someone,
Yeah. Right.
who has the exact same thing, as well as he struggles with depression as well. But it was interesting to discover we have the same problem. And
Hmm.
so it's interesting to relate to that. I'm pretty open with people. I'll say, yeah, I've got a mild form of OCD, mild in that, I have a job, I'm married, I have a happy life.
You're
It's not,
functioning, right?
I'm functioning, I'm normal. People don't know. People sometimes are surprised, like, oh, you seem so normal. I'm like, what? I am.
Yeah.
So I've shared it with people. I don't go around telling everyone, I don't tell very often the people that work for me, things like that. So, um, but, um, I'm pretty open with, especially if I'm talking to someone and I start hearing things in them that sound familiar. I'll start asking, have you ever heard of this? Or does that happen to you often? Because to me, the thought of somebody dealing with this and not knowing what it is, and living the way I had to at times um, before I got help, I hate the thought of that. It's like, hey, you can fix this,
Right.
So I've had a few conversations with people where I say, go home and Google this and read about it. And
Yeah. That's
so
great. You know,
this right here, this conversation is, the fact that this is going to be public is by far the most open thing I've ever done. But I have no problem talking to people about it. I
yeah.
think it's interesting.
Well, I just really again want to thank you so much for being this open, for sharing your experience. I know that being that I've worked with people who have OCD, and scrupulosity to some degree. I think that it is great that you're willing to be this open, to share the things that have worked for you, and the things that have worked for you may not work for somebody else or for everybody else. That's we one of the examples I give people, I'm really big on analogies, and it's I probably only have like a dozen that I go through,
Hey,
but
if they work,
so far so good. But it's like a pair of glasses. These glasses they work fantastic for me, and but to think that I can hand them over to you, and because they work for me, it'll work for you is a little short sighted. No pun intended. But it's but I think that it's a great place to start from. I think that you've given some really positive examples of how people who can seek help. If maybe it's a family member or a friend that you're starting to recognize this, or if you're a religious leader, it would be wonderful if we had some religious leaders listening and could identify or just be aware of this with, like you said, with the, 15 or 16-year-old who comes in and keeps confessing about similar things, or comes back and says, I don't think you quite understood me, or I didn't explain myself well enough last time, and it's I just think that would be very important. So I just really again want to thank you for that. Just to kind of round things off, you did say that you had a story about an onion peel. Did you want
Yeah.
did you want to share that
I
just
was,
to wrap
yeah,
things up? Okay.
sure. Yeah, the onion peel story. This is it's definitely not the most extreme incident that I had in my OCD, but I feel like it illustrates just the level of ridiculous that this can get to, where you can obsess over the smallest thing. So this was I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, when I knew at that time what I knew. I had OCD. I knew what scrupulosity was. I hadn't gotten on medication yet, so it was I would I would feel the full wrath of the emotions, but I knew not to do anything about it. So I'm in the grocery store one day, um, buying vegetables, I guess, and and I grabbed an onion, and you know how an onion has that dried peel on the outside that's kind of flaking
I
off.
stay away from vegetables, but yeah, I heard. No.
I don't eat very many, but
No.
at the time I was buying an onion. It probably rotted in the fridge, but I was married. My wife might have made something healthy with it. Anyway, so I pick up this onion, and there's just a loose piece of peel hanging off of it. And for no reason at all, I just plucked it off and dropped that piece of peel onto the pile of onions and put the onion into my basket. And I walk up to check out, and then I realized I just lightened the weight of this onion.
Oh
It
wow.
went from weighing, whatever amount to, a fraction of an ounce less than that.
Yeah.
This is ridiculous, but this is the reality of what this OCD is like. And so I thought, if that little chunk of onion peel makes the difference of 1 penny, if it's just, it's the straw on the camel's back that makes this onion worth 1 penny less, and they're not going to sell that chunk of onion peel, then in a way I've inadvertently stolen a penny from the grocery store. And this is the exact conversation going through my head. It's funny,
Mm.
reliving it almost stirs up the emotions of the moment, because
Wow.
in my head I'm telling myself, this is the most ridiculous thing you've ever thought. But despite that, I'm having the mini panic attack, and I'm
Right.
thinking it through, and I'm thinking, do I go back and get that chunk of peel and just, I don't know, somehow reattach it to the onion?
Go back through the line.
what and I thought, and like, there's no limit to how crazy it gets. Do I put the onion back? Well, no, I can't do that, because someone else will buy it without that chunk of peel. And the whole time I'm telling myself, you know what this is, you don't have to do anything. And I'm just, my heart's beating faster, and I'm having this swelling, awful feeling in my chest the whole time I'm checking out, walking out to the car. And I'm telling myself, don't do anything. Don't do anything. You're not doing anything wrong. This is ridiculous. But despite knowing all of that, um, it was almost I almost had a panic over it,
Wow.
and yeah, and it's funny, because people hear that and they're like, so an onion peel disrupted your life? It's like, no, most of the time it was something
It's
way
not about the onion peel.
no,
That-
most of the time it was way worse. It was a
Mm.
financial thing. It was,
Right.
I don't know, things like that. But the fact that my brain would go to that level of obsession over how much did that chunk of onion peel way? And did they just lose a penny? And I think, well, it's a penny. Who cares? But it's not my penny. It's their penny. And an
Right.
honest person doesn't steal. And
It's a great
yeah,
example.
so
That's
yeah,
a great example. Thank you for sharing that.
you're welcome.
And I really commend you for going out, for getting educated, finding some support, some help, and again for being as open as you have been with us. And so, thank you again for being here. We will, maybe we can circle back and have you on for to share other examples or just to
Sure.
join us for something else. So, but thank you so much, Kendall. Appreciate
Thank
that.
you. I didn't plug my book.